Welcome to the Q&A video series of ASP.NET Page and Application Lifecycle. In this video series, what we'll do is that we'll try to understand what are the different events which takes place right from the time the user sends a request until the time the request is rendered on the browser. So what we have done basically is that we have divided the videos into three parts. In the first part, we'll try to explain you how the environment is created, because the time a request is sent to the IIS for ASP.NET Page, the first thing what happens is a simple environment is created so that it can process the request. And in the second video, we will explain you how the request is basically processed. And finally, we will look into nitty-gritty details of how the ASP.NET Page lifecycle events look like. So let's start with the first question. Can you explain ASP.NET Page and Application Lifecycle? And in this, what we'll do is we'll first concentrate on the environment creation process. Now let's try to understand what happens the time a user sends a request to your Internet Information Server. Now the time a user sends a request, let's say that this is a request which is sent to your Internet Information Server, ASP.NET creates an ASP.NET environment. So basically it creates a simple ASP.NET environment. In other words, what it does is it creates four important objects, like the application object, the request object, the response object, and the context object. So in other words, it creates four objects so that it can process the request. So the first step, when the user sends a request, an ASP.NET environment is created, which basically is nothing but creation of these four objects, and then using this environment objects which are created, ASP.NET basically processes your request. So in other words, from the 30,000 feet level, ASP.NET request processing is nothing but it's basically a two-step process. The first one is the ASP.NET environment creation, and the second one is basically processing the request. Now in the processing of the request, basically it goes through handlers, it goes through modules, and it also has the page page events which fire. So what we'll do is that in this first part of the video, we'll concentrate on the ASP.NET environment creation. Now here's the overall process which basically takes place in order to create an ASP.NET environment. Now you can see that basically there are approximately 6 steps. We are going to go step by step what each of these steps are. So the first step, what happens is when the user sends a request, the first thing what your IIS does, it basically your IIS says that, okay, what is this request all about? And depending on the request type, it basically will decide who will serve the request. Now that is done by using the ISCP extensions. Now if you go to your Internet Information Server, and if you go to your basically to your properties, and if you click on the home directory tab, and from the home directory tab, if you click on configurations, you can see that over here there are basically certain ISCP extensions which are installed. For example, if you look at your left hand side, you can see that there are various extensions, and for each of these extensions, IIS knows basically who will serve the request. For example, if you see, let's say when you send a .aspx page, it says that will be served by using the ASP.NET ASP.NET _ ISCP DLL. So basically the first thing what happens is the time the user sends a request, IIS decides who will serve the request. Now once it is decided that who will serve the request, the next thing what the ASP.NET engine does, it basically it checks that if this is the first request. Now in case it is the first request, what it does is it uses the application manager class to create an app domain. Now app domain is nothing but basically it's a logical memory unit which is assigned for a process or for application. And by using app domain, what happens is basically it separates two applications or two websites separately, so that in case there are issues in one website, it doesn't affect the other one. So basically it will first check saying that is this the first request? Yes, this is the first request. It will then use the application manager class to create an app domain. Now inside the app domain, what it does it creates the hosting environment. And in the hosting environment, it creates various objects like HTTP context, HTTP request, HTTP response, etc. Many of the ASP.NET developers who are aware of the response objects, the request object, and context object, they must be aware of these vocabularies. So basically the application manager creates an app domain, the app domain basically creates a hosting environment, and inside the hosting environment basically you have the context class, the request class, and the response class. Now once the necessary objects, that is HTTP context, request, and response objects are created, the next step it does is basically it goes and creates the HTTP application object, and this HTTP application object basically processes your request. Now whatever process or whatever steps I had explained was in case if the request is first time. Now let's say that your request is coming for the second or the third time, then what happens is the HTTP application object is not created again and again. It is basically taken from the pool, and your current request object is attached to the HTTP application object to process it. Now depends, sometimes it is taken from the pool, or sometimes it is created for every request. Depends on what kind of settings you have done in your IIS. So in other words, what happens is basically your request is sent to the application manager class, and the application manager class creates an app domain, and inside the app domain you have your various objects, that is your context, your request, and the response object. Now if it is a first request, it will create the HTTP application object and process your request object. In case it is it's probably the second or the third time, what it does is basically it attaches the new request object to your HTTP application object. Now let's say that your application has a global.asx file. In case your application is having a global.asx file, then it will not create the HTTP application object, but it will create the object of the global.asx file. So that's one difference which basically differs in case you have a global.asx file or you do not have a global.asx file. Now remember that global.asx file is again nothing but it basically extends the HTTP application object. So in other words, it is of the similar type. Only thing is that it is more user friendly. In other words, you don't need to write a class as such to basically implement the HTTP application object. So this is the overall process of what happens basically when your ASP.NET environment is created. So in other words, your ASP.NET environment comprises of app domains, separate app domains for every website or web application or web request what is there, and inside the app domain you have various objects which are created in order to process the request, that is your request object, your response object, your context object, and all of these objects basically comprises your HTTP application object, and this HTTP application object basically processes your request. So now that we have understood that how the ASP.NET environment is created, now let's try to understand that how this request is processed. So in the next video we'll try to understand that how this request will be processed using this ASP.NET environment.